One of the biggest must-haves for any statist is Social Security. Without this safety net, the statists say, the elderly would starve, even though we conquered the problem of starvation before Social Security. And it's the job of the younger generation, who are fitter and richer, to take care of the old. But if you want to make this argument, there are numerous realities that you just have to face. And the same is true for Medicare, too. We'll focus on Social Security, but these arguments, combined with the previous video on universal healthcare, will let you know the problems with Medicare and Medicaid, too. So here are the things you're just going to have to deal with if you want to rationally defend Social Security. 1. Just admit it's a Ponzi scheme. A normal annuity is one where someone pays money in, the money is put to some form of investment, and later on the person is paid back from the proceeds from that investment money on a periodic basis, usually monthly. When Social Security began, that was exactly how it worked, and the Supreme Court, in Helvering v. Davis in 1937, declared that Social Security was constitutional because of this aspect of how it worked. 2 years later, in 1939, they changed it. Now, people were paid out not from money they had paid in that had been invested, but with money taken from existing workers in Social Security taxes. This makes it a Ponzi scheme, one where existing investors are paid off with money from new investors. Which raises one question. What happened to the money from the original investors? And the answer is, the people running the Ponzi scheme just spent it however they wanted. And when they get the money from new investors, they use whatever they need of it to pay off the old and just spend the rest on themselves. It's a scam because the money is gone, with no actual investment to keep the system going. Fundamentally, Social Security and a Ponzi scheme are the same, and there is just no reasonable way to deny this. If you're going to defend something, you have to defend it for what it is. If you can only defend it by pretending it's something other than what it is, all you're doing is telling us that you don't have any rational defense for your position. They have several ways they deny Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. One is that no one is being misled. Everyone knows what it is and how it works. The first objection to this is, it clearly isn't true. In fact, most people seem to think that Social Security works like an annuity, and if you ask many retirees if they think they're taking from the taxpayers, they'll say no, they're just getting back what they paid in. Also, government actively hides much of the cost from workers. The Social Security tax is 12.4% of your income, but if you look at your paycheck and see what's listed, the amount listed for Social Security tax is only 4.2% of your income. Make no mistake, the rest of it is being paid. They just aren't allowed to list it on your paycheck. Unless you're self-employed, you don't directly see the full 12.4%, just a much smaller 4.2%. But it is being taken from you. And you tell me no one's being misled? Give me a break. But even if everyone does understand completely what it is and how it works, it doesn't matter. It is irrelevant to what a Ponzi scheme is or why it's bad. A Ponzi scheme is bad because it relies on new investors to pay off the old. Knowing how it works doesn't change the fact that it does work that way. The reason why people who operate Ponzi scams in the private sector have to hide what they're doing is because people don't want to be part of such a scheme. But Social Security forces people to take part in it, so finding new investors is not a problem. They also say it's not a Ponzi scheme because it's intended to help people, to give them a safety net. But intentions don't change the facts. You can do bad things with good intentions and good things with bad intentions. Intentions do not matter, and pretending they do just tells us you're into wishy thinking, no more valid than the law of attraction. Basically, you're telling us that you believe in magic. Another claim is that it's not a Ponzi scheme because it's properly invested in U.S. Treasury bonds. This is persuasive only to people who don't know how Treasury bonds work. When you purchase a Treasury bond, the money goes into the Treasury, and politicians get to spend it however they want. When you get interest in your bonds, or when the principal gets paid back, it comes from money taken more recently from taxpayers. All this means is that Social Security is exactly like a Ponzi scam. Money from new investors goes to two places. Some of it goes to pay off the old investors, and the rest gets spent by the fund managers however they want. In this case, the money goes into treasury bonds, and politicians spend it on whatever their favorite boondoggles are. Then, when it comes time for you to be paid back, it can't come from any fund because the money isn't in any fund. It's gone, squandered long ago, and your Social Security paycheck comes from money taken from current taxpayers, either directly from the Social Security tax or indirectly from income tax and other sources going to pay the bond money back. That's it. The money isn't invested anywhere. It all comes from the taxpayers. Not to mention the fact that Social Security isn't running surpluses anymore. Social Security began running a deficit in 2010, meaning that the money it pays out is more than the combined total that it gets from Social Security tax revenues and bond payments. According to both the OASDI trustees and the Congressional Budget Office, this deficit is only going to increase for the foreseeable future. The Social Security Administration's response to this is that it's not a Ponzi scheme because, as long as the money coming in roughly matches the money going out, the system can continue indefinitely. But anyone who thinks about this for a fraction of a second will realize that this is mathematically impossible unless the system can be run at zero costs. A laughable prospect to say the least. In essence, if you make this argument, you're promising something for nothing. More magical thinking. In fact, the only real difference between Social Security and a Ponzi scheme is that people are forced to participate in it. Ordinarily, a Ponzi scheme self-destructs within a few years because it becomes impossible to find enough new investors to pay off the obligations to the old ones. But if you can force people to pay in, you can keep it going. But not indefinitely. Which brings me to number 2. Unsustainability. These deficits and other issues point to the unsustainability of Social Security. Proponents say that these can be fixed, or are only temporary. They're due to inflation, a recession, or the retiring of the baby boomers, or whatever. The first response to this is, then why not end inflation? But I guess we'll have to do how to argue for inflation some other time. No, the real point here is, even in an ideal scenario, it is still unsustainable. Even if every retiree takes 100% of what they put in and no more, as I said earlier, it's idiotic to think that the system can run at zero costs. So each year, you're going to have to collect enough money from taxpayers to pay the beneficiaries and cover the costs of the system. Which means that current workers will be paying more in Social Security tax, and since Social Security payments are based on what workers put in, that means they'll be drawing more when they retire, which means you have to tax people more, which means you have to pay them even more, which means you have to tax them even more than that, and so on until the system collapses. Not only can you not claim that Social Security isn't a Ponzi scheme because it's sustainable, because it isn't, you have to deal with this issue of sustainability if you still want to argue for Social Security. But even worse than that, you have to 3. Deal with the fact that the money goes to the richest age demographic in America. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, those over 65, those who are eligible for Social Security payments, have a median household net worth of over $170,000, whereas the richest age group under 65, the 55 to 64 demographic, only had just under $144,000. Also, between 2000 and 2011, median household net worth decreased for all age groups under 65 and increased for those 65 and older. What that means is that Social Security is a transfer of wealth from poorer people to richer people. And while it is true that the lowest quintile of people 65 and over did see their wealth drop during that time period, all of the other quintiles in that age group saw increases. But for those under 65, that can only be said for the third quintile of those 45 to 54 and the fifth quintile of those 44 and under. Add to that the fact that Social Security is a regressive tax. You stop paying it at a certain amount, which for 2015 is $118,500. So it's a regressive tax that transfers wealth from poorer people to wealthier people. Now you could argue that there are plenty of seniors who need this safety net, but with these numbers, you can really only support that notion for the lowest quintile. So at the very least, in order to make any sort of reasonable argument for Social Security, you need to have some form of means testing. Yet, Democrats in the U.S. and Social Security supporters in many other countries as well are vehemently against means testing, and they have 3 main excuses to make for this. The first is they make claims like seniors have such a low income. But the reason why they have low income is simply because most of them are retired. They're living off their net worth, so a lot of those seniors with low incomes have a yacht and a $2 million home on the lake. And hey, I don't begrudge them that. They worked for it all their adult lives, so they earned it. But there really is no argument that allows someone to defend taking tax money from poor people to give to them. So watch out when they start talking about the income of seniors, when it really is net worth you should be looking at. Means testing would mean making Social Security available to those with a low net worth. It's net worth, not income. Another argument is what liberals love to chime about: fairness. If they paid more to the system, they deserve to get more out. And since people who made higher incomes paid more in Social Security taxes, they deserve to get more back. This would be a fine argument if it were like a proper annuity, but remember number one, it just isn't. The money they paid into Social Security is gone. Some of it paid to other beneficiaries, and the rest squandered by politicians on their pet boondoggles. And if you want to talk fairness, consider this. Someone with a lower income, who is in more desperate need of the money, is more likely to take Social Security early, before full retirement age. But this person is actually penalized if they work and try to get in some extra income to make it through. And although you can recoup those losses, it can take up to 15 years after you reach full retirement age. The other argument, which is somewhat more reasonable, but only somewhat, is that since Social Security payments are based on what the person paid in Social Security taxes over his or her lifetime, then these rich people aren't getting that much money from it, since they only paid in so much due to the cap. The problem with this is they did pay into it up to the cap, and so, while they may not be getting as much in terms of a percentage of their lifetime income, they're still drawing as much from Social Security as anyone else is. It's still poor people being taxed to benefit the rich. The thing is, even with means testing, based on these numbers from the Census Bureau, you still couldn't justify taxing people in the first quintile or people under 35 in the second quintile to pay for it. Yet, the Social Security tax is levied on the first dollar. 12.4% is always taken until you reach the limit. 4. Increasing costs and decreasing benefits. One way you can tell a Ponzi scheme is if the return on investments decrease as time goes on. A Ponzi scheme might start out offering 10%, then go down to 2% as it becomes more and more difficult to pay off obligations. That can only be done by increasing costs and/or decreasing benefits. Of course, as the rate of return drops, it becomes harder and harder to find new investors, but remember, Social Security doesn't have that problem. Always remember the gun in the room. So Social Security, being a Ponzi scheme, needs to increase costs to keep going. When Social Security first started in 1937, the tax was just 2% of the first $3,000 of taxable earnings. That's $48,900 in 2015 dollars. Then in 1951, they started raising the cap, and in 1954, they started increasing the percentage of the Social Security tax. So now it's 12.4% of the first $118,500. With an increase in both the cap and the rate, the maximum you could pay to Social Security in a year, all in 2015 dollars, went from $978 to $14,694. So yeah, way increased costs. One of the ways that Social Security decreases benefits is by increasing the retirement age. In 1983, Congress passed legislation to do just that. If you were born before 1943, your full retirement age is 65. But if you were born between 1943 and 1954, it's 66. And it gradually rises to 67 for people born in 1960 or later. The age to get early retirement benefits is still 62, but there's more of a reduction. A sneaky way to decrease benefits is to tax seniors more. Originally, beneficiaries had to pay no taxes on the money they got in Social Security. Then, the 1983 amendment to the Social Security Act ridiculously and paradoxically made 50% of Social Security payments taxable income. 10 years later, the 1993 Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act increased that to 85%. And notice, both passed by Democratic Congresses, the latter signed by Clinton. An overall 1/3 reduction in benefits on average. Yeah, that's a great way to help seniors, isn't it? By taking their money. A similar thing happened with Medicare. Part B and Part D now have surcharges the beneficiaries have to pay. And there's always the risk, in fact it's quite probable, of Congress cutting benefits even further. The risk of future benefit reductions means that it's better for a poor person to defer payments until 70 when they could really use them sooner, and better for a rich person to draw early when they don't really need it. And this will only get worse because of the unsustainability mentioned earlier. Current rate of return for Social Security has been dropping, and is currently only about 1.3%, lower than most money market accounts. For most retirement plans, you could have more money for your retirement by putting even 1/3 of the money taxed by Social Security. And this rate of return may dip into the negative numbers over the next 10 years, and by 2030 is projected to be a loss of over 10%. And that's if you're lucky enough to be white, because 5. Social Security has inherent inequalities. If you're an African American male, your average lifespan is 70.68 years. For a white American, it's 78.74, over 10 years longer. So the average white person will draw on Social Security for 10 years longer than the average African American male, even when they've both paid in the same amount. And in fact, unlike the meager 1.3% rate of return we just mentioned, if you're a low-income single African American male, you can expect to get back less than 88 cents for every dollar you paid in. Your rate of return is already negative. Not only would you be better off with pretty much any retirement or savings plan, you'd be better off stuffing the money in your mattress. And I hate to break it to you, but this isn't an accident. In fact, when Social Security was first implemented in America, most women and minorities were specifically excluded from it by denying the program to domestic workers, teachers, nurses, librarians, agricultural laborers, and other professions dominated by women and minorities. Yes, the first Social Security recipient was a woman, Ida Mae Fuller, but she was a legal secretary who went to school with Calvin Coolidge. Most women got bupkis. The NAACP vociferously protested Social Security at the time and called it a sieve with holes just big enough for the majority of Negroes to fall through. It hasn't much changed. It also depends on where you live. If you're in California, your average lifespan is 80.37 years, which means you'll be drawing on Social Security for over 5.5 years longer than someone from Mississippi who, on average, only lives 74.81 years. Overall, people in richer states live longer than people in poorer states, mostly the southern states, which means people in the richer states will be drawing on Social Security longer, getting a disproportionately higher rate of return. It's one more way Social Security is a transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. No, you can't defend Social Security by citing fairness, or we're getting back what we paid, or because the poor need a social safety net. If you want to argue for Social Security, you need to not only stop using those arguments, but deal with the socioeconomic inequalities as well. 6. Consider the words of Henry Hazlitt. Pretty much for all of the videos in this series, Economics in One Lesson is a must-read. It's available for free several places online. The base of this lesson is one very important warning. Doesn't everybody know, in his personal life, that there are all sorts of indulgences delightful at the moment, but disastrous in the end? Doesn't every little boy know that if he eats enough candy he will get sick? Doesn't the fellow who gets drunk know that he will wake up the next morning with a ghastly stomach and a horrible head? Doesn't the dipsomaniac know that he is ruining his liver and shortening his life? Doesn't the Don Juan know that he is letting himself in for every sort of risk, from blackmail to disease? Finally, to bring it to the economic, though still personal realm, do not the idler and the spendthrift know, even in the midst of their glorious fling, that they are heading for a future of debt and poverty? Yet when we enter the field of public economics, these elementary truths are ignored. There are men regarded today as brilliant economists who deprecate saving and recommend squandering on a national scale as the way of economic salvation. And when anyone points to what the consequences of these policies will be in the long run, they reply flippantly, as might the prodigal son of a warning father, In the long run, we are all dead. And such shallow wisecracks pass as devastating epigrams and the ripest wisdom. But the tragedy is that, on the contrary, we are already suffering the long-run consequences of the policies of the remote or recent past. Today is already the tomorrow which the bad economist yesterday urged us to ignore. The long-run consequences of some economic policies may become evident in a few months. Others may not become evident for several years. Still others may not become evident for decades. But in every case, those long-run consequences are contained in the policy as surely as the hen was in the egg, the flower in the seed. From this aspect, therefore, the whole of economics can be reduced to a single lesson, and that lesson can be reduced to a single sentence. The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. That is exactly what I've been doing here in this video, and that is exactly what proponents of Social Security continually fail to do. All of the things that have been done and are doing to try and save Social Security and Medicaid amount to nothing more than kicking the can down the road a little farther. Worse than that, it's like the can gets bigger each time and harder to kick. The fact remains, for all the blather about fairness and responsibility, it is incredibly irresponsible to make the future face the costs of the present, and incredibly unfair to put those costs on the shoulders of the unborn. This is probably the hardest thing to conquer if you want to make a case for Social Security, as it fails on both moral and practical grounds. It goes against the very things you say are moral, and as a matter of practicality, causes much more misery than it saves. You must overcome this if you want to argue for Social Security. And if it seems unfair to make you climb such a high mountain of countenance, all I have to say is, we didn't start this. It was John Maynard Keynes who said the quote Hazlitt gave, "In the long run, we are all dead." Well, Keynes is dead, and the long run is here. The question is, what do you think we should do now?